LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of child abuse and violent crime. Please listen with care. For over a century, the Dozier School For Boys operated under the guise of reforming wayward children. When it closed in 2011, forensic anthropologist Erin Kimmerle investigated the school grounds with one objective: how many children were buried there. What she discovered beneath its grassy pastures was evidence of extreme neglect, abuse, forced labour, and even murder, further supporting the decades-long accusations of institutional abuse from victim survivors and families. In this episode, hear how, in the process of finding answers for loved ones, Erin faced hostility not only from the local community, but also law enforcement. My name's Kathryn Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author, and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world.
So the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys opened in 1900, and it was supposed to be a reform school for troubled and wayward boys and girls who got caught up in the penal system. At the time, Florida, like most of the American South, didn't have prisons. They had a convict lease system. So children, like adults, were basically arrested for a crime and then put out for labor, to turpentine or railroads or whatever the industry was. And it was this idea to, hey, let's give children an education and reform and teach them job skills so they become productive citizens. And in 2005, a group of men came forward who had been there in the 1960s and claimed they all had very similar stories, didn't know each other, but had been abused when they were at that institution. Then the school closed in 2011, and we started doing our work and looking at it right at the time it was closing. So the men came forward with allegations of physical and sexual abuse, and also stories about boys who had died, and it was sort of unknown who had died there. The school never kept a roster or ledger or any kind of plot map. They would bury those who died in unmarked graves. And so it was recognized that there was a burial ground, but no one really knew. And some of the people who came forward along with the men who had been there were families of the boys who died. And they'd been going to the school and going to the state government, since the children died in the 30s and 40s to get answers, to have the remains returned to them. So in 2011, started to look at it and thought, what can anthropology offer? And what happened is the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, so that's the state's top law enforcement agency, they did an investigation and said nothing bad ever happened here. The graves are all accounted for, sort of case closed, nothing to look at. And that just felt wrong.
Erin, can you give us a description of what the school looked like and how it was laid out, just so we can get some sort of idea as to where the graves were located on the property?
So the campus had been at one time 1,400 acres, and it was segregated into what they called whites and colored. And so colored was African American, Latino, basically anybody not white. And so the two campuses, if you will, the two schools, were nearly identical to one another, dormitory, dining hall, but they differed in terms of the industry. So on the white side of campus, you had all of your trades like electrical shop, carpentry shop, printing. They actually did all the printing for the state of Florida for decades. And then on the colored side, on the African American side, you had the farm And it was a huge dairy farm and cotton fields and agricultural fields and pastures. And it was there in the pasture where they had put up these crosses that commemorated the burials. Those crosses had been put there in like the 1990s by a local Boy Scout troop. Basically what had happened is they had run into some of the graves during tree planting. And then everyone was kind of reminded like, oh yeah, there's supposedly graves here. A lot of these buildings just looked abandoned, kind of like if everyone just got up and left. So like there's still furniture, records, an old pair of shoes. Like it was very sort of apocalyptic looking in the sense that, now the buildings have ivy growing on them and it just looks very abandoned, but they're full of all kinds of information.
How many children did they document had died over those years? Are we talking 10? Are we talking 100?
So the official accounting that the state law enforcement agency came up with in their investigation was 31. And they had basically put up in more recent years, in the 1980s, 31 crosses just to commemorate the burial grounds. It didn't really correspond to graves, but that was their best estimate. They went and talked to the former superintendent of the school, and he said, oh, it's probably too many, but better to have too many crosses than too few. That was his quote. But when you start looking at the historic records, the school's reports, newspaper accounts, we put together a list of over 100 children that died.
What was the documentation like for the numbers who came in and out? What was the average time spent there? What was their record keeping like? And was that a hindrance or a help?
Well, I would say it was a little of both. So there were records in the sense that there were ledgers, and they had basements of old buildings, basically ledgers, where they had written in the child's name when he would come to the school, what his charge was, his sentence. Children would run away all the time and get captured. So like the runaway, recapture, and then ultimately like discharged and what happened to them. The school managers changed the law in the early years of the school so that they would be in charge of parole rather than the judge. So a judge sentenced the children, but they changed it so that the managers could do that. And what you see then is the sentences get longer. So they, are keeping them until they're often 20 or 21 and hiring them out to local farms for labor. The idea was, okay, you're giving kids job skills and then the money that the school made would help sustain it. But what you see year after year is malfeasance. So one superintendent would use school money, buy adjacent property, send the boys to cut the lumber, charge the school, and then sell the lumber and keep the money. And early on, from 1902, so just the earliest years, all the way until it's closed in 2011, was one report after another of abuse, poor nutrition, children as young as 5 years old being chained to the walls, being forced to work.
Children as young as 5 being convicted of a crime. Sorry, I just need to clarify that.
Yes, if you're 5, you're being charged with incorrigibility. Skipping school, truancy was a big one. And you can imagine that many of those who fell into the system came from families in poverty. That was one thing I always said, where were all the incorrigible judges' children, right? They weren't sent there. And so they were really at the mercy of the system. You also see a disproportionate number of African-American children. They weren't supposed to send orphans, but many of them were orphans or, came from a single parent home, maybe skipped school that day.
Did the families have legal representation for the children? How did the conviction process work?
So in those years, I say early years, but really the first 70 years, there were no civil rights. And so children did not have any rights either. So there were no lawyers. Parents were not notified ahead of time. Basically, they'd be picked up, sentenced, and shipped off, and then the families would get notified by the court. This is a time of Jim Crow laws. So here in the South, you have, these vagrancy laws, right? Like you show up in town for work, but you don't have an address. You can be arrested and sent to prison. So that was happening to adults. It was just now being applied to children as well.
Vagrancy, that I remember even in Australia, my mother crying one day because she only had 20 cents in her purse. And she was crying because she said, I could be arrested for vagrancy if I don't have, what was it, $5 or something on her at the time. So if that applied monetary-wise for people who couldn't obviously support themselves or buy a place for the night to stay in, that's really targeting lower socioeconomic poor people. And then how do they defend themselves or pay the fine or whatever it was going to be? What happens then?
Exactly. And that's what made the convict lease system work, is that basically you show up in court, you can't immediately pay the fine. And so there's a labor boss there who says, I'll pay it. Now you become the ward of that labor boss who's responsible for your well-being, your food, your clothing, your medicine. And so the clock or the bill starts ticking too. Once they take custody of you, you're now in debt because you have to pay your lodging, your food, the medicine you're probably not ever going to get. But, all of those things that would be basic needs. And so your sentence is going to be several years because you have to work off basically your room and board as well as the original fine.
It sounds like Dickens times. And yet this was going until the 2000s.
Yeah, what changed, significantly here was the civil rights legislation that passed in the late 1960s that started to give people very basic legal rights, ended child labor. So that definitely impacted the school. It didn't close the school and it didn't stop the abuse from happening, but it did change the way labor was managed and hired.
So it sounds as if these children were condemned very, very early in their lives with absolutely no recourse and their families with very little resources. How did you then become involved in excavating graves?
So basically what I did is approached it as a historic cemetery project because they said, hey, there's no crime, there's nothing criminal, no criminal investigation. We applied for an archaeology permit. And so we went in with just a really basic research question. Can we find the cemetery? Can we find the burials? And how many are there? And so we started doing the field work to search for them. And we estimated 50 burials. So that was huge because the state said there was 31.
What did you base that on?
So there's a couple of things that we do. One was ground penetrating radar. So using remote sensing to search for burials. And then we analyze that data and estimate, okay, this is where we think there's burials. And then we ground truth it. And so what we do is using archaeology, basic archaeology, dig shallow trenches, 25, 35 centimeters, under the surface. You can look at the soil. And the soil is going to tell you when it's been disturbed versus when it's sort of virgin, intact, undisturbed. And so we use that to ground truth our remote sensing results.
What did you find in the excavations?
We actually found 55 burials. So we had missed several that had been underneath trees and a fence post that we hadn't been able to access. We found 8 of the boys whose families we had been working with and had DNA samples for, so we could positively identify them and return them to their families, which was incredible because that's, exactly why we're doing this work. And so to be able to go to them and say, yes, we found your brother, we found your uncle, was pretty incredible. And we found that, 5 of the boys buried there, we don't know who they are at all. I don't even have names on a list. Everyone who possibly died there that I can find record of can be accounted for, except for these 5. I don't know who they are. It took a number of years. I'll say when we started, I thought, okay, this will be a couple weeks of field work, and it turned into several years.
Were you able to determine cause of death in any of the cases and in any of the remains you found?
Unfortunately, preservation was not very good. The barrels are very wet. The water table there is very high. It was good enough in that we were able to get DNA, but unfortunately, the remains were just in a state that it really made it difficult to say anything about, if there were any injuries or would have caused the death. We did discover a lot more in the historic record and a lot of suspicious deaths. For example, 9 of the boys died after running away. So one of them, his death certificate says injury to forehead. Do I know exactly what caused the injury? No. But, it's suspicious, and it was omitted from the state law enforcement report in 2009. Another death that had been omitted was a boy named Robert Hewitt, who had escaped from the school and run home. He lived a few miles from the school. He had grown up in that area. And that weekend, his sister said they came looking for him, and she believes that they shot him. He was found dead with a gunshot wound. No one was ever charged, and his death certificate says shot by person or persons unknown. So there's certainly things that can lead you to speculate what likely happened. But in terms of physical evidence of injuries to prove cause of death, we were really stuck.
Were the families ever allowed to come and view their loved ones, or were they notified when it happened and allowed to attend any sort of burial, or were they completely removed from it?
In every case, all the families that we met, they were notified after the fact. And in fact, one of the families we talked to were on their way driving up there. And when they were notified that they, found George Owen Smith was his name, found him dead, they said, we'll keep him at a funeral home and we're going to come collect him. And when they got there, they were shown his grave. They felt so convinced that they had been killed there, that something nefarious happened, because it didn't make any sense to them, why they wouldn't be notified, why they wouldn't be allowed to take the body back. And I think that, it frustrated them. They kept going back to the school all these years and were always turned away, even to the point where in recent times, the state was doing an investigation saying nothing ever happened. And yet a lot of this was left out of the report.
What range of ages were of the children you found in the graves?
So we had a very young one, 5 to 6, all the way to 21. And the boy who had been 21 had actually been hired out for labor again, kind of like working to earn his bus fare home, and died. We don't know why. And the school just brought him back. And there was another case of a little 6-year-old who had been hired out, basically like a houseboy, died. We don't know what caused his death. And he was brought back and just buried at the school, which I don't know. There was something about those 2 cases that always just struck me. It's like, these are children, these are people, and you just bring them back to the school, you're done with them.
Were you able to determine, in terms of bones at all, state of malnutrition or state of nutrition? Could you pick up anything like rickets or any TB affecting bone, any of those sorts of things that could possibly have led to a cause of death?
So that's a good question. We did find a high number of bone infections in the ear, the middle ear, so something we call mastoiditis. So it's a chronic, severe inner ear infections. We also saw a pretty significant gap between dental age and skeletal age, which sometimes there's variation in that, but they should match for the most part. And I think that mismatch is showing, kind of a failure to thrive or of malnutrition where skeletally, they're not growing. Things like Harris lines, little lines show up in the bones you can see in radiographs when there's malnutrition. We also saw very high frequency of dental caries, dental pathologies untreated. And why I particularly took note of that was the school always reported back to the state all this, health care and dental care that they were giving. And so I just thought it was interesting that we didn't see one example of any dental care. In fact, some of them had 13, 14 active cavities basically that were happening. So that was interesting just to see that mismatch in the record.
It's also interesting that failure to thrive can be from emotional neglect as well in young children.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of them died within the first month or several months of arriving there. And one of the things, I talked to many of this, men who were there as children in the 50s and 60s. And one thing I always asked all of them was, when you were sent there, had you ever been away from home before? And not one of them ever had. At that time, it was, it's not like you did sleepovers like kids do today. And, they've never been away from home. It was the first time. So I can just imagine the fear and, the effect that would have on them. So among the survivors, they were consistent in that there was, corporal punishment in the form of whippings. And there was a certain building, which was called the White House, because it was this little White House. And that's where the corporal punishment occurred. But in terms of those who died, what we found that was suspicious was just different types of blunt trauma and then those examples of gunshot injuries.
How long do you think the abuse continued, according to the witnesses, up until how recently?
Well, in the 1980s, the federal government came in and took it over for about a 10-year period because children were being hogtied, left in isolation for months at a time. So there was still a lot of psychological and physical abuse happening. And reports of that continued up until the time it closed in 2011. The school officially closed, according to the governor at the time, because of financial reasons. But the investigative reporters that were really actively sort of looking into the school and looking into what was going on today were reporting all kinds of abuse allegations that were still currently happening.
Did any of the staff at any stage come forward or try and whistleblow?
They did. There was investigative news reports, scathing legislative reports, families who, parents and staff. And every single time, it just got put under the rug. They would change the name of the school. The school's name changed several times. They rebranded. They didn't call it that then, but that's exactly what they did. And just kept on business as usual, though, because all the people and the culture stayed exactly the same.
When you were excavating or beginning the excavations, at what stage did you actually realise that this is a truly horrific situation and you suspected something was wrong? But when did you actually realise, and how did that affect you emotionally?
There were a few different times where there was sort of this moment, I think, I don't want to say an aha moment, but where it felt like I felt the weight of what we were doing. When I realized, we're out there ground truthing, we think that there's 50 burials, and now we're ground truthing it, and one after another, it looks like burial, burial, burial. And just the realization that, officially there's supposed to be 39. To find 50 is a big difference. And it's just, at the time already, it was very much in the public arena. It was very political. There was a lot of pushback from the local community and from state government to stop what we were doing. And sort of the more we found, the more families wanted it to go all the way, wanted excavation, wanted identification. And so the more they asked for that, the state, said no. Initially, every sort of channel we went to try and do the excavation was turned down. The local police chief wanted to charge us and arrest us for desecration of burials. The very burials that they denied existed, now we're, going to be in trouble for desecrating them. So I think that, the weight of that was there when we finally got that permission and did the first excavation, and we're sort of finding the bones and the teeth and the soil. But, we're starting to do it, and it's like, okay, there's no more denying it.
How did you feel when you went back to the survivors and revealed the stories to them?
It was a good feeling. I mean, it sounds a little macabre sometimes to say that when you do this work, but it's like, on the one hand, this is the job that I do. So to be able to do it through completion, to find what you're looking for, there is a satisfaction in that. Like Ovell, she was the sister of George Jones Smith, who I got to know very well. She was in her 80s. She was a woman who is one of Florida's first female police officers because she, went into that line of work with this idea, I'm going to find out what happened to my brother. So she knew he was dead. She'd been shown his unmarked grave, but wanted him back. And so to say, yeah, although we found him, I mean, she was in disbelief. She just kept saying, is it true? Are you sure? And said, yeah, we really found him. And so it was a good feeling. And just to, be able to do that for her.
God, after 80 years, that's incredibly powerful. Has anyone been held accountable to date or is likely to be held accountable? Are there any criminal investigations ongoing? And does the community still have a similar attitude about the school not wanting investigations and not wanting further progression of cases?
So no one in the history of the school has ever been held criminally responsible for anything that happened there. In the modern investigation, the reasons that were given were that the statute of limitations had run out, so they couldn't go back and prosecute. The named individuals had died, were deceased. And in one case, a good friend of mine who I met through this work, Robert Straley, who had been raped there when he was 12, would have fallen under a provision in our federal law that didn't have a statute of limitations. However, because that happened in 1961 and it wasn't a crime in 1961 in the statutes, they decided they couldn't prosecute. So even though we tried really hard to find examples and ways to hold the few remaining people accountable, and that individual was still living at the time, it's just not to be. And that's why I think we did focus a lot, and with the men who were survivors and with the families, talk about how can justice look, in these other forms, and what does it mean to you. They did have a ceiling of the White House, but several days after the government did that, they reneged it and decided that they didn't want to sort of admit anything at the time, so they took that back. I think that fueled the men really to start their campaign. And since then, and since our work, the state has apologized, given an official apology. And just this year, they passed a reparations bill to help give some financial aid to men who were abused there in the 1950s and 60s. So that was something that they fought for many years, and it finally just passed this year.
So there will be some financial compensation, which is never going to compensate for their childhoods and what happened to them, but it is some recognition of wrongdoing. How does the community feel about what's been revealed there now?
Well, I like that question, because one thing that I learned through this whole process is that there are several different communities. So there is the part of the community that is the power structure that really fought against everything we did. I don't think they've changed their position. They see this as a smear on the reputation of their fathers and grandfathers. They think it's embarrassing, and want people to move on. Forget about what happened in the past. Let's just move on. But then there are communities such as largely the African American community there who continue to live with a lot of discrimination and inequity and see and feel these same injustices daily. It's just part of a very long story. And they were always very supportive and encouraging of this work. And so I think that, that's been very positive.
How did the families respond to your findings?
We told every family in person what we found. When we had the opportunity to give them the remains back and they had reburial ceremonies, we attended those. And I think that they just were kind of shocked, honestly, in disbelief. I mean, imagine seeking something, searching and asking. You're asking the state government for decades and being told, no, it's impossible. It can't be done. The graves are too old. You'll never find them. I think they were pretty much in shock, but extremely happy, extremely grateful. One man who, Richard Varnado, we found his brother. He said to me, after he'd been returned to them and reburied, they had put a headstone in the cemetery, and he wanted to show me. So I went there with him, and he said, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me in my whole life.
I grew up thinking forensic anthropology was like sociology and discovering how people lived in the past. But since learning about forensic anthropology, I think you do one of the coolest things with forensic anthropology, and it involves human rights. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, thank you. The field has changed so much since I first was, in college and starting my career, and I love it. I'm very passionate about it. It's just, what I've always wanted to do. But I remember starting out, so many people would say, what are you going to ever do with that kind of degree? And it's definitely changed a lot and become a really integral part of the justice system here and internationally. So one of the ways in which forensic anthropology is used in human rights investigations, and I think that's what really drew me to this field and drew me to this type of work, was this idea that you can help enforce human rights through a very actionable way with the court system, where you're helping find forensic evidence, identify people who were killed in conflict, and determine what caused their death. And that can be used in war crime tribunals or genocide trials. And so determining cause of death and the trauma and the injuries is a really integral part of that. When you have civilians or injured soldiers, or people killed in unlawful ways, execution style, for example, then those all become war crimes. So anthropology can be very important in those investigations, especially because you're going back often years later. Once there's been a government change, they're not necessarily investigated at the time of the crime, but sometimes decades later.
I'm constantly impressed by the humanity of the forensic teams that do this sort of work. And it's difficult for you as well, emotionally, physically, processing all of these things. Do you think the families trust the forensic communities to actually be looking for the truth?
I think so. That's always been my experience. There can be, we do a lot of cold case work, right? So we're going back and helping to identify individuals, who are often murder victims 10, 20, 40 years later. And there can be a lot of frustration and distrust, I think, with families that have felt let down by the justice system. Why is it taking so long? They maybe didn't get the same treatment throughout all those years because, the personnel changes. That's the one thing, at least here in the United States, the detectives are constantly rotating, and that can contribute to why cases get back shelved and not solved for years. So I think there can be a lot of frustration. But I also think that, they've been incredibly helpful, grateful, proactive, and, trying to get any help that they can. I think it's a very desperate, and sad situation to be in. And I think that's why, for me, one of the motivating factors in doing this work is always, I just think of it is how I would feel if it was someone I loved, or, if my child was missing, what would I do, or what would I want people to do? And that's sort of the perspective that I think most of us take when doing this work.
I think in some ways a forensic anthropologist, once bones have been found, are almost a last resort, but a last hope as well. Is that a fair statement?
It is, because when we talk about this with missing persons all the time, because it's kind of like the other side of that coin of unidentified remains. They represent somewhere there's a missing person, and I think for families, there's always the hope that they'll be found alive and well, and so it can be very difficult. Then we're there, obviously looking for clandestine graves or, burials or, excavating burials. It's the worst sort of case scenario. But I think, that's when you hear families say over and over again, they just need to know, whether that's the outcome or not. Not knowing is worse than that.
A lot of people just want their truth told, and that's really important for victims of so many crimes. Do you think that helps quell the anger that can last intergenerationally if there is a sense of injustice?
I do. I think there comes an acceptance with knowing what happened. Even in the most heinous type of crimes that we've seen, one thing that the families of the victim and survivors always, say is that they just want to know what happened. Sort of no matter how brutal the truth is, they need to understand it. And it's not closure. Sometimes people talk about that, like, that suddenly you're okay with it. You're never okay with it. But there's a certain acceptance that comes with just understanding. And I think that gives people some type of peace that they can reconcile.
This has been brilliant. Erin, thank you so much. And what I think is really amazing about the way you tell these historical events and stories and revelations about this horrific institutionalised abuse and legally sanctioned abuse, community sanctioned abuse, I've really had a feeling that these children are real, and I could feel some of their trauma with the way you tell their stories. And I think that's the most powerful thing that you can do in terms of human rights and prevention. And thank you for using anthropological science for that as well.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Kathryn Fox, and is produced by Holly Mitchell, Ed Gooden and Jade Murray. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.